The moment the access card reader flashed red, I already knew. Not because I was expecting it, because I'd built the system that controlled it. 41 years old, 17 years at Meridian Energy Solutions in Calgary, and the first thing I felt wasn't anger. It was something quieter, almost like relief. I stood in the hallway outside the main server room, the same hallway where I'd once run cables at 2 in the morning because the deadline was Monday and nobody else knew how, and I watched the little LED blink from green to red, and I thought, he actually did it. My son-in-law had actually done it. Let me back up. I spent the better part of my 30s building something that most people in the energy sector didn't believe was possible. An adaptive load balancing algorithm. I know that sounds like I'm reading from a manual, so let me put it plainly. Alberta's power grid is complicated. You've got oil sands operations running 24 hours a day, residential demand that spikes in January when it's -35, renewable inputs that fluctuate with wind and cloud cover, coordinating all of that in real time, predicting demand surges before they happen, rerouting capacity automatically without human intervention. That's what my system did. I called it ARCA. Adaptive Resource and Capacity Allocator. My daughter used to joke that it sounded like a character from a kid's show. She wasn't wrong. I built the first working prototype in my garage in Airdrie. This was 2011. I was still working days at Meridian as a senior systems engineer, and I'd come home, eat whatever was in the fridge, and spend 3 or 4 hours coding. My ex-wife by now. But that's a different story. Used to bring me coffee around 10 and say, "Still at it?" And I'd say yes, and she'd shake her head and go to bed. For 2 years, that was my life. In 2013, Meridian's founder, a man I'll call the founder because he deserves that respect, saw a demonstration I put together for the internal R&D team. He sat in the boardroom with his reading glasses halfway down his nose and watched the simulation for about 12 minutes without saying anything. Then he said, "How long to make this production ready?" I said 18 months if I had the right team. He said, "You'll have them." He also said something else. He said, "I want you protected on this." He had his legal team draw up an IP agreement that was unusually clear for a corporate document, the algorithm, its architecture, its core logic, mine. Meridian held an exclusive operating license, renewable every 5 years, with a clause 14.2, that stated the license would automatically terminate if I was removed from the company under circumstances other than voluntary resignation or documented cause. His words. His lawyers. I remember reading it twice, thinking it was overly cautious. That was my mistake, not the clause. The fact that I thought I'd never need it. ARCA went live in 2015. By 2018, Meridian had contracts with 4 provincial utilities and 2 federal infrastructure bodies. The Department of Natural Resources was using a version of the system to model national grid resilience scenarios. I'm not trying to make myself sound important. I'm telling you this because it matters for what comes next. The founder stepped back in 2020. Health reasons. He brought in a CEO from outside, someone with the background in finance and acquisitions, which made sense given where the company was going. What nobody quite expected was how quickly that CEO started grooming his son for an executive role. His son was 26. He had an MBA from Queen's. He had never worked in energy, infrastructure, or anything remotely technical. What he had was confidence, a good blazer, and a father who thought the word vision could substitute for experience. He joined as VP of Innovation. I didn't have a strong reaction at first. I've worked with plenty of people who had the title without the knowledge. That's just corporate life. What I noticed, slowly, over about 8 months, was that he started attending every technical meeting, started asking questions that were framed as curiosity, but felt like something else, started requesting documentation on ARCA's architecture for investor materials. I flagged it with HR. Twice. I was told I was being territorial. Then, in February, a Thursday, which I remember because I had a Flames game on in the background when I got the calendar invite, I was called into the boardroom. The CEO was there. His son was there. 2 people from legal I didn't recognize, and my direct manager, who would not make eye contact with me the entire meeting. The CEO's son did most of the talking. He said that following a strategic review, Meridian had determined that ARCA needed to be repositioned as a core proprietary asset. He used that exact phrase. He had clearly rehearsed it. He said the company was preparing for a Series C raise and needed clean IP ownership for the pitch deck. He said the legal team had reviewed my original consulting agreement, not the IP agreement, a different document I'd signed in 2009 before the IP agreement even existed, and had determined that work produced during my employment belonged to Meridian. I said, "That's not what the IP agreement says." He said, "We're not here to debate agreements." I said, "Where's the founder?" His father said the founder had recused himself from operational decisions. His son slid a folder across the table. Inside was a separation package, 32 days' pay in lieu of notice, the minimum under the Alberta Employment Standards Code, a non-disclosure agreement, and a line at the bottom about full transfer of all intellectual property developed during my tenure. I looked at the folder. I looked at him. I said, "You might want to read Clause 14.2 before this goes any further." He said, "We've reviewed all relevant clauses." I said, "Okay." I put the folder back on the table. I stood up. I said, "I won't be signing this today." And I walked out. My access card was dead before I reached the server room hallway, which is, as I said, where this story began. I drove home to Airdrie. I called my lawyer, a woman I've known since we were both in our late 20s, who does nothing but IP and commercial litigation, who once told me the best contract is one the other side never thinks they'll need to use. I told her what happened. She was quiet for about 4 seconds. Then she said, "Tell me they didn't put the separation offer in writing." I said they had. She said, "Good, don't touch it." We spent the next 10 days building the file. The original IP agreement, time-stamped and notarized. The 2009 consulting agreement they tried to invoke, which explicitly excluded work developed outside of company hours using personal equipment, which ARCA's prototype absolutely was. Git commit logs from my personal repository going back to 2011, before I'd ever shown the company a single line. Email chains where the founder himself referred to it as your system and your algorithm. A registered copyright on the ARCA architecture that I had filed, quietly, on my own lawyer's advice in 2014. I also did something else. When I originally built ARCA, I had embedded a passive verification layer. This is not uncommon in complex software. It's a kind of digital watermark, not visible in normal operation, not something that affects performance, but something that, if you know where to look, identifies the original author and creation date with cryptographic precision. I had never mentioned this to anyone at Meridian. It wasn't deception. It was just the kind of thing a careful engineer does. The way a photographer keeps the original RAW file even after they've delivered the edited JPEG. Meridian, as it turned out, was planning to file a patent application for ARCA's core architecture. Their legal team had prepared the application during the same weeks they were preparing my termination. The filing date was set for the Monday after they let me go. We filed an opposition on the Friday before. I want to be clear about what I was not doing. I was not trying to shut the company down. I had colleagues there, good engineers who had nothing to do with any of this, who had families and mortgages, and who came to work every day and did honest work. I had no interest in hurting them. What I wanted was simple. I wanted the record corrected, and I wanted the license clause 14.2.2 honored. Clause 14.2.2 meant that the moment Meridian terminated me without documented cause, the operating license for ARCA automatically terminated as well. Not suspended, not renegotiated. Terminated. The company could not legally operate the system until a new license agreement was in place. With me. Their legal team, apparently, had read the clause and decided it wasn't enforceable. Or they'd decided to proceed and deal with it later. I'm still not sure which. Either way, they went ahead with their Series C roadshow using ARCA as the centerpiece of their pitch. The federal infrastructure body, the one using ARCA for national grid modeling, runs compliance verification on all third-party software it licenses on a rolling basis. Automated. Routine. The verification process checks, among other things, that the licensing chain for all embedded IP is intact and current. On a Wednesday morning in March, at approximately 8:47 a.m. Mountain Time, that verification check came back with a flag. The operating license for ARCA's core architecture was no longer valid. The contract the federal body had with Meridian referenced that architecture specifically. Their legal obligation required them to suspend use pending resolution. I found out because my lawyer called me. I was at my kitchen table in Airdrie, having coffee, watching the snow come down on the Rockies through the window. She said, "It started." I said, "How bad?" She said, "They're going to call you by end of day." The CEO's son called at 2:15 p.m. He did not announce himself. He said, "We need to talk about ARCA." His voice was not the voice of someone who had rehearsed what he was going to say. I said, "I'm listening." He said there had been a compliance issue, and they needed to clarify the licensing situation before it escalated further. I said, "I'm happy to clarify. The license terminated when you terminated me. That's what Clause 14.2 says." He said, "We're prepared to discuss a new agreement." I said, "I know you are." I told him to have his legal team contact my lawyer. What I didn't tell him was what else was happening at the same time. The Series C roadshow had two lead investors. One was a Toronto-based infrastructure fund. The other was a Vancouver-based pension investment arm that manages contributions for about 40,000 public sector workers in British Columbia. Both had been pitched ARCA as proprietary Meridian IP. Both had due diligence teams. When the federal compliance flag hit, one of those due diligence teams made a call. Within 24 hours, both investors had issued notices of concern and paused their commitments, pending verification of IP ownership. The Series C, which had been announced internally with a kind of triumphant memo from the CEO about the next chapter for Meridian, was on hold. I heard through a former colleague, someone who called me, quietly, from their personal phone, that the offices were very quiet that week, that people were keeping their heads down, that the CEO was in meetings from 8 in the morning until 7 at night, that his son had stopped doing the walkabouts he'd taken to doing, the ones where he'd stroll through the engineering floor with a coffee and ask people what they were working on, like a man who owned the place. He did come to one more meeting, in person, this time, with his father, two external lawyers, and a woman who introduced herself as a resolution specialist, which is apparently a real job title. My lawyer and I met them at a boardroom in a building on 9th Avenue in Calgary. I remember the drive-in, the February cold, the Bow River glinting through the ice. I remember thinking I'd spent 17 years building something real, and that reality doesn't care how many people try to rewrite it. The meeting lasted 4 hours. I won't go through all of it. Here's the short version. Meridian acknowledged that the original IP agreement was valid and enforceable. They acknowledged that Clause 14.2 had been triggered by my termination. They acknowledged that the 2009 consulting agreement they tried to invoke did not supersede the IP agreement and had been misread or misrepresented. They chose the word misinterpreted. I accepted that word, not because I believed it, but because I didn't need them to admit to anything beyond what was already in writing. The new license agreement gave me a 6.2% royalty on all revenue derived from ARCA and its derivative systems, calculated quarterly, audited annually, for as long as the system remained in commercial use. There was also a lump sum. I won't give the exact number, but it was enough that I paid off my mortgage in Airdrie and still had something left over, covering the period from my termination to the signing of the new agreement, during which Meridian had continued to operate the system. I was also given a written acknowledgement of authorship, incorporated into all future licensing and investor materials. My name, my creation date, my original documentation, not buried in a footnote, in the main body. The CEO's son signed the agreement. He signed it with a pen he'd brought himself, which I thought was an odd detail to notice, but I noticed it anyway. He didn't look at me when he signed. His father looked tired. My lawyer walked out with me onto 9th Avenue. It was cold enough that our breath made small clouds. She said, "You okay?" I said I thought so. She said, "For what it's worth, I've done a lot of these. Most people don't hold together the way you did." I said I just didn't want to fight about something that was already true. She laughed. She said, "That's the whole job, actually." The Series C closed 3 months later, with my royalty structure disclosed and documented. One of the investors, the pension fund, actually cited clean IP ownership as a positive signal in their commitment letter. I have a copy of it somewhere. I still live in Airdrie. I consult now independently. I have 3 clients, none of them Meridian. I ski on weekends when the conditions are good, which in Alberta is most of the winter. My daughter asks me sometimes if I'm angry about what happened. I tell her the honest answer, which is not really. I built something that worked. I protected it because someone who'd never built anything wanted to put their name on it. The system, the legal system, the technical architecture, the original agreements drawn up by a man who believed in doing things right. All of it worked the way it was supposed to. That's the part people don't talk about enough. Not the revenge. The preparation. The 17 years of showing up and doing the work. The IP agreement I almost didn't bother to read a second time. The watermark I embedded on a Tuesday night in 2014 because it seemed like the careful thing to do. The careful thing, it turns out, is usually the right thing. I got a message 3 weeks after the settlement from the founder. He's retired now, down in the Okanagan. He said he'd heard how it went. He said he was sorry it had come to that. He said he never imagined his company would be used that way. I wrote back and told him the company he built was solid. It was just the one built on top of it that had the problem. He replied with a single line, "Good." That's what I needed to hear. That message is still in my inbox. I keep it because it's the closest thing to a verdict I've ever needed. There's a version of this story where I come out looking like someone who planned a careful revenge. I want to be honest, that's not what happened. What happened is that I spent 17 years doing the work correctly, and when someone tried to rewrite that, the record simply wouldn't cooperate. I think about my son-in-law sometimes, not with anger, but with something closer to puzzlement. He's a smart person in certain ways. He understood pitch decks and investor psychology and how to walk into a room and make people feel like they were hearing something new. What he didn't understand, and what I don't think anyone taught him, is that integrity isn't a policy you adopt when it's convenient. It's either the foundation of how you operate or it isn't. There's no middle setting. When he signed those investor materials knowing the IP chain was contested, he made a choice. That choice didn't catch up with him because I was watching. It caught up with him because that's what choices do. I built Arca the way I built it because I believed it mattered to do it right. The watermark I embedded in 2014 wasn't strategy. It was just the careful thing. The IP agreement I read twice wasn't paranoia. It was just the responsible thing. 17 years of showing up, of running cables at 2 in the morning, of choosing precision over shortcuts. None of that was done in anticipation of a fight. It was just how I thought a person should work. And when the fight came anyway, all of that groundwork turned out to be exactly what I needed. I've thought a lot about what separates the people who endure situations like this from the ones who don't. It's not luck, and it's not connections, though both help. It's not connections, though both help. It's something quieter. It's the willingness to do the unglamorous preparation when nobody's watching. To file the copyright registration on a Tuesday night. To read the clause a second time. To keep the original repository instead of assuming you'll never need it. That kind of discipline. The kind that doesn't make for a good story until suddenly it makes for the only story. Is built slowly, over years, and it doesn't look like anything until the moment it looks like everything. My daughter asked me once whether I thought what happened was fair. I said I thought it was accurate, which is different. Fair implies a judge somewhere making deliberate decisions. What I experienced was more like physics. The things I'd built were real. The record of when and how I'd built them was real. No amount of corporate maneuvering could change those facts, because facts don't negotiate. The founder's message is still in my inbox. I keep it because it reminds me that the people who do things right, who draw up honest agreements, who give credit where it belongs, who build institutions they're proud of, those people exist. They're not naive. They're not idealistic in the soft sense of the word. They're just people who understood, early, that the way you do things is inseparable from what you end up with. I'm not angry at how it went. I'm grateful I was prepared.